Equal Rights Amendment was first proposed to Congress in 1923. So why isn't it law yet? And why does it seem to be eternally shrouded in conflict? To address these larger ponderings, we have to travel back before Biden declared the ERA law of the land in January of 2025, before Virginia finally became the 38th state to ratify the amendment in 2020, and even before the ERA was finally passed by Congress in 1972 after decades of debate. To fully understand the beginnings of the conflict surrounding the ERA, particularly the division between feminists over the ERA, we need to go back to the 1920s, the years just following the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. In this moment, women who had committed their lives thus far to obtaining suffrage in the United States had to make a decision. What is this new world going to look like for women? And what do we need to do next? They could have been satisfied with gaining the right to vote. However, these astute women quickly concluded that the right to vote did not remove as many barriers for women as they had hoped. That being said, not all feminists moved forward in unison. In fact, the decision to write the ERA severed the collaborative ties between feminist pillar activists Alice Paul and Florence Kelley. One woman saw explicit general recognition of equality, whilst the other hoped to continue their life's work supporting women and those most in need with special legislation, and she specifically focused on women and children. You might find yourself wondering, why couldn't these goals work in tandem? Enter the Taft Court with a key decision in the case Adkins v. Children's Hospital, a case ruled during a pivotal moment in what has come to be known as the Lochner Era. Both women were deeply connected to this case, and its outcome turned what started as a line in the sand into a crater. Kelley and Paul were not simply collecting signatures on petitions and managing picket lines. Those things are very important and have a place. But for these two women specifically, they were highly educated on the law and up to date on the political landscape that they were living through. So what issues were entangled with women's rights during this period? Labor reform. Conversations surrounding work, especially as it intersects with traditional views of the home, are central to understanding the rise and fall of the ERA. Though some reservations about the ERA were pre-existing for Kelley and other progressive labor activists, the Taft Court solidified a not here, not now environment in which many of these progressive labor activists determined that the ERA would actually be weaponized against women once the court had to start interpreting its meaning. So, let's take a journey to the years leading up to the first proposal of the ERA and see if we can answer the question: how did court rulings during the Lochner era influence feminist perspectives on the creation of the Equal Rights Amendment? Now, to answer this, we have to focus on three key components. First, we have to look at Alice Paul and Florence Kelley separately and kind of get a feel for their individual activist work. Then we really need to dig into the legal context. What was the Lochner era, and then how was it so connected to the ERA, labor reform, etc.? And then finally, once we have these contextual pieces built out, we can start to look at how Paul, Kelley, and their allies leading up to the first ERA in 1923 were interacting with each other. We're going to conclude this by examining the legacy of this initial conflict and assessing the state of the ERA today in 2025. To understand the ERA, it is essential to consider the ratification of the 19th Amendment first. So let's start there. The importance of the 19th Amendment and the achievement that it was cannot be overstated. However, immediately following ratification, many feminists realized that suffrage did not bring them equality under the law. Many were asking, did suffrage make the sexes equal? Several court cases indicated that the 19th Amendment did not. Examples of cases that support this fact, both before and after the initial proposal of the ERA, include cases centered around women and jury service. Some examples with this were State v. James, 1921, People ex rel. Fife v. Barnett, 1925, Commonwealth v. Genevieve Woloski, 1931, and Hoyt v. Florida, 1961. Alice Paul co-founded the National Women's Party during the pursuit of suffrage, and the group decided to pivot to a new goal of removing all other sex discrimination that existed in the law, left unaddressed by the 19th Amendment. The original plan was to create a series of bills to bring about equality of the sexes under the law. However, after Alice Paul and Elsie Hill met with professor and legal scholar Albert Levitt of Georgetown University, they took his advice, and they began drafting a proposal for a constitutional amendment that would eventually evolve into the 1923 ERA. Historian Rebecca DeWolf says that the writing of the first ERA was an arduous, almost 3-year drafting process, and it was rife with debates, falling outs with former advisors and collaborators, and fierce opponents. Alice Paul is credited with being the principal author of the first draft of the ERA, but Crystal Eastman contributed to that first draft, and Levitt was definitely one of the sparks that led to the conceptualization of a constitutional amendment. Throughout the drafting process, several early proponents of the ERA made it their mission to promote the idea of a constitutional amendment and, importantly, to enlist influential legal scholars and activists to lend weight to their proposal. One such person, whom the NWP and Paul worked hard to convert to the cause of the ERA, was Florence Kelley. By 1921, Florence Kelley was a household name for activists. She worked primarily in labor activism, serving as the head of the National Consumers League, here on out known as the NCL. She was also a force for suffrage, leading up to the ratification of the 19th Amendment, and an abolitionist. Fortunately for Paul, Kelley was never fully supportive of the ERA, and in fact became one of its fiercest opponents. If we judge the past through the lens of the present, or even the lens of the recent past, it can be easy to assume that the divisions in this first conflict of the ERA were between feminist and anti-feminist. We do see a version of that conflict play out in the 1970s, where a fight between women like Gloria Steinem, Margaret Sloan Hunter, and Phyllis Schlafly came to a head. The reality is, some of the most vigorous opposition to the first proposal of the ERA came from not only fellow feminists, but feminists who were actively working to improve women's experiences in the U.S. through the law. Historian Rebecca DeWolf divided these feminist factions into two camps, the emancipationist and the protectionist. Emancipationists were in favor of the ERA and sought to eliminate laws based on sex to achieve full equality. Protectionists, on the other hand, took a maternalistic approach, advocating for sex-specific laws that would protect women, such as minimum wages and maximum working hours. To understand this division, we will explore the experiences of two women who were key pillars of feminist activist work during this period and became opposing forces. Let's start with Alice Paul. Alice Paul led the National Women's Party, the NWP, and was essential in mobilizing suffragists in new, radical ways to achieve the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Paul previously spent time in the United Kingdom observing and supporting the suffragettes like Emmeline Pankhurst, who took on a more militant tactic than what was typically seen in the United States at this time. She brought those ideas to the U.S. and initially broke away from more conservative suffragists to employ these new strategies that she picked up. Here, you can see fellow suffragists protesting for Paul's release from prison and the prison hospital where Paul was kept. Following the successful ratification of the 19th Amendment, Paul turned the NWP toward the idea of increasing women's equality by eliminating discriminatory practices rooted in the concept of English common law's coverture. This is the notion that women are under the protection or guardianship of the patriarch in their lives. This could be a father, a brother, a husband, but either way, women were covered by this man. Paul had multiple academic degrees, many of which were in the field of law. She was well prepared for this moment through her experiences, travels, studies, and as you will soon see, through her connections. As Paul started working on the ERA through the encouragement of supporters like Professor Albert Levitt of Georgetown University, she also began working to sign on influential supporters to be vocal about the ERA. Ultimately, Paul will go against many of her former allies and determine that the ERA needed to remove all sex differences in the law, including any protections that singled out women and could potentially create a disadvantage for them when seeking employment or other opportunities. Here, the roots for discord were planted with labor activists like Florence Kelley. Like Paul, Kelley was an active participant in the suffrage movement and was, for a time, also affiliated with the NWP. However, Kelley's work extended well beyond suffrage and women's rights. Kelley was central to progressive labor reforms happening in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Kelley began her work in the 1890s in Chicago, but expanded her progressive labor reforms to other states, federal courts, and even to Europe. Kelley was a resident worker with Jane Addams in Hull House and encouraged Addams to go beyond meeting the needs of those who actually showed up at Hull House for support and instead to focus as well on organizing and taking legal action for change. Later, Kelley worked in partnership with Louise Brandeis for the Supreme Court case Muller v. Oregon, in which he wrote the now commonplace Brandeis brief, a legal brief that brings in social data to support legal arguments. In a letter to her son, Kelley expressed her intent to get a powerful lawyer like Brandeis for that case. Regarding the upcoming case itself, she said, "We are having an exciting time in the matter of working hours. The laundrymen of Oregon have appealed to the Supreme Court of the U.S. against an Oregon Supreme Court decision upholding the 10 hours law for women. We, of course, are for the 10 hours a day by statute." She was in the trenches, working closely with those that she was fighting for through the law. Kelley worked very closely with Josephine Goldmark leading up to the case, and historian Catherine Sklar said that Goldmark wrote all but the introductory portion of the brief. Muller was one of Kelley's major wins, as it set a precedent for limiting women's work hours in the name of women's health and safety. So the sharp turn from this case later to what happens with Atkins v. Children's Hospital was a huge blow for her. Kelley went on to be a leader of the Women's Joint Congressional Committee and was essential in the passing of the Shepherd-Towner Act. Historian Elizabeth Masaryk notes that this act provided matching funds to states that developed educational programs in maternity and infancy health and hygiene. This was one of the first social welfare programs implemented at the federal level, and Kelley was a major contributor to the process. So at this point, you may be wondering, how did Paul and Kelley end up on opposing sides of the ERA? Both women dedicated their lives to improving the lived experiences of women, wanted the law to work for women, and were highly educated and active feminists. Yet their position on how the law would best support women is what is going to take a stark turn in 1921. From Kelley and her allies' Muller victory to the final push for the 19th Amendment, the Shepherd-Towner Act, the official proposal of the ERA in Congress, it all took place during a time of court rulings referred to as the Lochner Era. This truly is a source of conflict between these pillar feminist groups as well as their allies, so we have to pause our story to get some legal context before we see the full breakdown between Kelley and Paul specifically. We cannot understand their positions separate from the social and legal context in which they were working. The Lochner Era refers to the years just before the Lochner v. New York case in 1905 through 1937, when the Supreme Court took a sharp ideological turn in the West Coast v. Parrish Hotel case. This period was tightly wound up in the late 19th and early 20th century debate over the 14th Amendment and whether due process included the concept of liberty of contract. More specifically, whether the government should establish workplace regulations in areas like wages or working hours, or if each individual employee should be free to negotiate these independently, free from government interference with their employers. Ultimately, one side argued that if the government set wage minimums or maximums for legal working hours, it would limit the potential for individual workers to earn more money, thus interfering with their rights as citizens of the United States under the 14th Amendment. The other side argued that the freedom of contract position did not address the terrible labor conditions, the exploitation of workers, or allow for them to have a quality of life with ample time for leisure. So the government had a responsibility for the health and safety of all workers to regulate the system. Ultimately, Lochner, a case focused on regulating working hours for bakers, would uphold freedom of contract, thus removing government interference in many spheres of society to protect workers. There were a few exceptions to this idea during the Lochner era, though. Legal scholars Joseph Fishkin and William Forbath noted that before Lochner, safety laws for factories, mines, women, and children were often upheld. However, post-Lochner, if a law seemed like it might interfere in any way with bargaining power, wealth, or workplace authority, it was more often struck down. The line between health and safety versus bargaining power became much trickier to navigate legally in this era. The fact that the Mueller case, which limited working hours for women, was able to get through in this era was undoubtedly a win for Kelley and her allies, and hopefully understanding the context of this legal world makes that a little bit more clear. In the argument presented by Brandeis and others on the legal team in Mueller, they stated the Oregon statute limiting women's work hours was obviously enacted for the purpose of protecting the public health, safety, and welfare, as the female employees are not protected from overwork. An emergency is hereby declared to exist. This is also a great example of how labor activists had learned to think more and more in the language of the law, and how the Lochner era reshaped the labor movement's dominant ideology, as legal scholar William Forbath argues. Similarly, historian Joan Zimmerman argues that women and activists like Paul and Kelley discovered that in order to convince judges that the laws they proposed were constitutional, they had to fit their proposals into structures of legal thought. The conflicting interpretations of those structures of legal thought assimilated by Kelley and Paul estranged the two wings of the women's movement. This is essential because the two women were not always in conflict, but as they pushed past the 19th Amendment and reworked their strategies to fit the legal era in which they existed, they took opposing paths. We now know our key players, Kelley and Paul, and we have a working background on the legal and social context. So what actually happened between them, and what role did the court play in this tension? Prior to the official announcement of the ERA, Paul and Kelley were in communication about the possibility of an amendment. However, this communication was happening as the legal tides were turning for Kelley, and seemingly in favor of equality of the sexes under the law. There was also communication between common acquaintances of Paul and Kelley that highlighted specifically Kelley's mounting frustration over the impacts of the murmurings of a potential ERA. For example, a common point of connection that Kelley and Paul had was Roscoe Pound. He was the dean of Harvard Law School in the 1920s. For a time, Pound was also serving as an advisor to Paul on the progress of writing the ERA. Kelley wrote Pound on June 3, 1921, and noted that her and Paul had met to discuss the ERA earlier that day. Additionally, she shared that two other NWP members, Maud Younger and Elsie Hill, had met with her multiple times on the issue already. It is clear that the NWP was trying to court Kelley for their cause. At this moment, at least, her opinion mattered. Kelley made it clear to Pound in her letter that she rushed to write him because Paul told her after their meeting and conversation that she would share Kelley's comments and feedback with Pound as they continued to discuss the drafting of the ERA. Kelley said she wanted to make sure that Pound heard from her first, so as not to have her words misconstrued by Paul. So clearly here there was already some miscommunication or maybe a lack of trust early on in their conversations between Paul and Kelley. As an aside, I love how subtle yet hot the tea can be when digging into these old letters, but back to the story. Kelley goes on in her letter to Dean Pound to state, "There is at this moment an insanity prevalent among women where one would least expect it. This insanity expresses itself in eager demands for identical treatment with that accorded to men. My fear is that the drafts submitted do, in spite of all the criticism that they have undergone, still involve danger of the same nature that we have been encountering in connection with due process. Another fear related to that is that the temper of the times cannot fail to dispose the courts, especially the lower courts, to yield more or less under the pressure of the mad women." Losses were also starting to come in waves for Kelley and the NCL at this moment, heightening her senses to the shifts in the legal atmosphere as the Lochner era progressed. In a March 1921 letter to Julia Lathrop, the first chief of the Children's Bureau, Kelley expressed frustrations over an unsuccessful bill for public health services and lamented that they were not only winning nothing but by way of losing measures unanimously upheld by a reactionary court of appeals. Kelley was fearful and cognizant of this shift in the courts since her previous victories, and historian Sklar argues that this shift was in large part due to the increased push for men and women to be seen as equal under the law, following the passing of the 19th Amendment. Women had been in some ways exempt from the Lochner ideals, but this was changing. In her reference letter to Dean Pound, Kelley makes a note of the insanity of arguing for equality through a vague amendment when society did not see the genders as equal, and this was especially true for the courts. Kelley's fears over the courts can be seen once again in her letter to Paul Younger, a co-conspirator of Alice Paul and the NWP, when she stated in October 1921 that she was opposed to blanket measures and vague words in bills and constitutional measures. Further, Paul Younger, in a previous letter, assured Kelley that the NWP was not working on a draft that would touch upon the field of industrial legislation, to which Kelley argued that such a draft is unthinkable. The courts alone could make such a decision. If your measure should unhappily be enacted, there would, it is greatly to be feared, follow another 15 years of effort necessary to a final agreement by the courts as to the meaning of your ambiguous phraseology. As you can see, by the end of 1921, things were already tense. Kelley and the NCL, as well as Paul and the NWP, were both fighting the inequality women were facing. But again, their perspectives on the law, how courts would interpret the law, and what was most effective had become drastically different. Just days prior to writing Younger, Kelley parted ways with the NWP. In a letter to Paul, she formally requested to have her name removed from the list of members of the Advisory Committee of the National Women's Party. After hearing from Senator Charles Curtis, who later officially presented the ERA to Congress alongside Susan B. Anthony's nephew, Senator Daniel R. Anthony, that he had promised Paul that he would introduce a blanket measure intended to remove the political disabilities of women. Following this letter, Paul and Kelley diverged paths, and each was navigating their chosen allies, namely men with political and legal influence, in an attempt to control what happened next with the ERA. Historian Sklar notes that one member of the NCL, Edith Spruance of Wilmington, Delaware, wrote to Alice Paul stating that Kelley was starting to stack the board of directors so that the entire league could be used as a force to oppose the ERA officially. Yet, through December of 1921, Kelley and Paul were still in communication, with Kelley noting in a letter to Clara Southwick that she told Paul she had still not given up hope, to which she said Paul replied, "We have not taken the last irrevocable step. Our amendment is not yet introduced." The conversation and moments thus far have been within the activist world, but there was a point beginning in January 1922 when the debate over the ERA began to move to the public. First, you can see this happen in January 1922. Kelley and the NCL published a pamphlet titled 20 Questions About the Federal Amendment Proposed by the National Woman's Party, in which she shared that the version of the amendment at that time and stated her position that only the Supreme Court could ultimately answer the questions that she was going to present. Her fear was that it would influence existing laws, such as those state laws which had used police power to influence labor conditions, thus throwing the status of women, children, and workers in flux for potentially decades while they debated the amendment. DeWolf argues that the pamphlet's wide circulation swayed many perceptions, as she listed multiple areas that might be called into question due to mainly the wording of the ERA. Then, in April 1922, Florence Kelley, representing the NCL, and Elsie Hill, representing the NWP, had a written debate published in The Nation, in which each side presented their arguments for and against the ERA. In late 1922, Paul and the NWP decided to take all of this conflict and channel it into a nationwide study about the condition of women in the U.S. Bernita Shelton Matthews, the legal sector of the NWP, showed through their study that because of the common law influence on laws, women in several states were suffering legal prejudices in the areas of guardianship laws, inheritance laws, and married women's economic rights. Further, the NWP made an official switch in their language here, as they found through their research that sex-specific laws, like those Kelley and the NCL were fighting hard to extend and preserve, were making women seem like expensive luxuries, according to historian Rebecca DeWolf, and damaging their economic prospects. DeWolf also notes that instead of creating a better work environment, the laws were shutting many women out of the workplace entirely. While the NWP was compiling a report, Kelley was in contact with Felix Frankfurter as he was preparing for the upcoming Adkins case, after the D.C. Court of Appeals maintained that the district's minimum wage board was unconstitutional. Kelley published her update on what was happening with Adkins, along with a public condemnation of the NWP's new assertion that it was opposed to all protective labor laws for women in the December 1922 edition of the survey. In the spring of 1923, the Supreme Court released its Adkins v. Children's Hospital decision, in which it upheld the position that setting a minimum wage for women was unconstitutional. An essential piece of this case is that Kelley was in support of and in direct communication with Felix Frankfurter, arguing for the minimum wage laws. On the other side, legal scholar Julie Sook notes that Alice Paul was a consultant to the lawyers who represented the employer, Children's Hospital, and she helped the employee's lawyer link equal rights for women to the liberty of contract pronounced by Lochner. Sook also notes that Justice George Sutherland, who authored the Adkins decision for the Supreme Court, was serving as an advisor to Paul on the ERA before he joined the Supreme Court. Paul and Kelley, and in turn the NWP and the NCL, more or less went to battle by proxy in the Supreme Court through the Adkins case. Historian Zimmerman notes Adkins was an avenue to desired reforms for the National Woman's Party, making Kelley and her allies' defeat a big win for Paul and her allies. And in a letter to Julia Lathrop following the decision in Adkins, Kelley compared it to the Dred Scott case, which ultimately limited the freedom to exist for free Black Americans, undermined states' capacity to regulate enslavement in their own territories, and led to the expansion of slave codes. In essence, it was completely unconstitutional, and the Supreme Court was wrong. Kelley's connection to this case had to do with the unconstitutionality. She did not feel that a realignment with Lochner and the use of due process to enforce liberty of contract was constitutional. And while her opposition to the ERA can definitely be viewed as controversial and even frustrating in hindsight, ultimately Lochner was overturned and labeled as part of the canon of wrongfully decided cases by the U.S. Supreme Court. The Supreme Court with Adkins effectively overruled Mueller as they pivoted back to reconfirm Lochner's freedom of contract idea, and they used the 19th Amendment as a way to justify denying special legislation for women beyond those cases that could be very clearly linked to physical health. Just 8 months later, the official announcement of the ERA in newspapers occurred following the 75th anniversary celebration of the Seneca Falls Convention on July 21st, 1923. The timing of this drop is much more interesting once you understand just how involved Kelley and Paul were with Adkins and the layers upon layers that exist in this first conflict over the ERA. As we explored earlier, historian Rebecca DeWolf divided original feminists, largely influenced by Paul on one side and Kelley on the other, into two camps: the protectionists and the emancipationists, which emerged and solidified in the years leading up to and following the Adkins v. Children's Hospital decision. So, do these two camps still exist today? And is that why the ERA doesn't exist as a law? Well, yes and no. The emancipationists and protectionists continue to exist with ebbs and flows in their influence over time. However, they evolved into more liberal, the former, and more conservative, the latter, ideological standings. With the Great Depression and World Wars, women entered the workforce out of necessity, but many stayed when they realized that having two incomes really benefited their families. This was more acceptable than in the past, yet as anxieties over the economy, men's job prospects mounted, a shift occurred. Now, it does have to be noted here that a lot of the women who entered the workforce in these moments in history, while that was novel for them, there were a lot of women who were forced into the workforce long before that, and they never left it. And so there is some intersectionality and nuance that has to exist with this conversation around labor as you're progressing forward in history. However, DeWolf does argue that the emancipationists began to lose their support following World War II significantly. Conversely, the protectionists are going to jump in and strategically leverage the momentum of overcoming wartime instability to revive the anti-ERA campaign. But the protectionists had evolved into something slightly different at this point. They still argued that women needed special legislation, but it began to take on a more conservative tone that would reach a new peak in the 1970s. Instead of just the fear of a blanket amendment that might allow the courts to weaken women's standing in society as Florence Kelley saw it, now protectionists argued that women held specific roles in society that needed to be maintained. With that in mind, where does the ERA stand today? Well, complicating matters. The preamble to the ERA included a 7-year time limit for ratification, followed by a 3-year extension granted from Congress with a 1982 cutoff. So when Virginia became the 38th state, people began to argue, well, Sorry, the time limit has already passed. But a proposal to remove this time limit from the original ERA was sent to Congress in 2023. If Congress chooses to act on this, they do have the legal standing to remove the timeline because the timeline was imposed by Congress. It was not a constitutional mandate that a timeline be attached to these amendments. As protectionists have come to the front and center of our political climate, the lack of constitutional protections against sex discrimination is more apparent than ever. Julie Sook argues that the passing of the ERA in Congress in the 1970s did influence court decisions, even without formal ratification, stating Supreme Court justices recognized Congress's passage of the ERA as they invalidated laws that discriminated on account of sex. From that perspective, the ERA was able to make improvements, but the problem is that some of those same changes, like Roe v. Wade, for example, have now come undone because sex discrimination cases did not have the constitutional support for the highest and strictest form of judicial review absent an amendment. So where does the ERA go from here then? DeWolf argues that protectionist concerns that women will lose essential rights that are sex-specific have to be considered in the conversations around the ERA moving forward if feminists are ever going to unite. The roots of these fears are deep, and Florence Kelley's persistent pushback against the ERA, along with her allies, is a testament to how fear of the court can be used to influence potential supporters to shy away from sex equality in the law. I could talk to Florence Kelley today, I would probably tell her that I completely understand why she opposed the ERA in the moment that she did. But I struggle to connect her work and her legacy with the protectionists who continue to push for traditional gender roles and against the ERA today, as well as those who argue that the ERA is no longer necessary. I understand Kelley's fears about the temperament of the court, and in fact, I've shared those fears over the plasticity that exists in the court. Kelley's 1923 fears over the shifting courts were followed by a shift in the court that ultimately was in her favor in 1937. And we are now in a moment where we are seeing shifting ideologies once again in 2025. The court will always be in flux because it does not exist separately from our political and social context. Ultimately, Kelley wanted sex-specific laws for protection, but she missed that sex-specific laws for protection also open the door for sex-specific laws that allow for discrimination. And this is what women like Paul and Crystal Eastman were trying to get across. The ERA would not remove important protections necessarily, but it would require that any protections in place be applied en masse. So instead of women getting sex-specific laws for minimum wage and working hour exploitation, they were simply saying, apply that to everybody. And again, eventually, after 1937, those labor-specific issues were addressed. But because Kelley didn't have that foresight, the ERA became the villain. And when we needed the ERA for protection later down the line, it wasn't there. We can learn a lesson from both Kelley and Paul in this era, and that is the value of being plugged in to the legal and social context in which one exists, because it made a huge impact on both sides. Their capacity to adjust their strategies in sync with the movement of the legal precedents and social occurrences was inspired. This astuteness will be necessary if the ERA is to have constitutional standing in the future.